On behalf of the Patient Safety Authority, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar titled Leadership, Emotional Intelligence During Uncertain Times. My name is Melanie Motz, and I will be your moderator for this program. A copy of today's slides is available using the link provided in the chat box. The chat box can be found by clicking on the chat button in the lower right corner of your screen, and then you'll see the chat bubble. The webinar will be available in a few weeks on the Patient Safety Authority's YouTube channel. We welcome any comments or questions. All materials are provided for your educational use. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the webinar. Dr. Angela Coladonato is the Senior Vice President and Chief Nursing Officer at Chester County Hospital, Penn Medicine, a position she has held for 14 years. Angela is an experienced healthcare administrator with over 35 years of experience in a variety of settings. She is a strong leader with a reputation of integrity, who has built cohesive teams and participated in strategic planning and clinical program development. Dr. Coladonato, I'd like to turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I became interested in emotional intelligence during my doctoral work for my DNP. I actually did my project on how nurse leader emotional intelligence affects the staff nurse job satisfaction, and I did write an article on that. And ever since I did that, I just became more and more enthralled with the concept of emotional intelligence and how it can help me as a leader. It's a work in progress. I continuously work on fine-tuning, strengthening my emotional intelligence, and it certainly is a journey. So I hope today you will glean some tips and learn a little bit more about emotional intelligence and how it can help you as a leader, both professionally and in your personal life. Specifically, at towards the middle of the presentation, we're going to talk specifically about how emotional intelligence will help us during uncertain times. And of course, right now, we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty in our world. The pandemic has certainly brought a lot of uncertainty to all of us. So I'm going to begin first off talking about some of the learning objectives for today. First is to define the concept of emotional intelligence. The second objective is to summarize the 4 domains of emotional intelligence, and then identify a few tips for you to help lead with emotional intelligence, and discuss a few ways that you can increase your own emotional intelligence. So those are our objectives for today. I'm going to start off the presentation with a quote from the CEO of Deloitte Global. And he says, "In everything they do during a crisis, resilient leaders express empathy and compassion for the human side of upheaval." You will hear that word empathy in a lot of the presentation, and it is so tied to emotional intelligence. So just think about that as we go through the presentation today. We're going to talk about today how can controlling and managing your emotions help you be a better leader and better equipped to manage and lead during uncertain times and in a time of crisis. Another quote from David Caruso, and David Caruso is a management psychologist who develops and conducts emotional intelligence training around the world. And his quote is so impactful to me, and I'm going to tie it back again later in the presentation. But he says emotional intelligence is not the opposite of intelligence. It's not the triumph of heart over head. It's the intersection of both. Very important as we go through the presentation to keep that in mind. Emotional intelligence consists of factors that are related to success in life. It helps us understand why some people do well in life and why others fail. And it's completely distinct from your IQ, which is defined obviously as your cognitive intelligence or your intellect. The next slide are distinct qualities that we all possess. We all have an IQ, we all have an EQ or an emotional intelligence quotient, and we all have a personality. And together they determine how we think and how we act. And it's impossible to predict one based on another. People may be intelligent, have a high IQ, but not have a high EQ, or vice versa. And people of all types of personalities can be either high in EQ or high in IQ. And they're all distinct from each other. I'm going to ask you a quick question, and if you can just note it in the chat, and Melanie will read back some of the responses if you so desire to put something in the chat. But what age, are you aware of what age your IQ is determined by? So what age is your IQ, and it never changes? Just note something in the chat if you would, and then Mel, if anybody writes anything in the chat, if you can read it back to me, and then I'll tell you the answer. I'll wait just a few seconds.
Okay, so we have 23, 14, 7,
Okay.
21, 10.
Okay, great. So whoever guessed 14 is the closest. Your IQ is determined by age 15. So at age 15, your IQ is your IQ, doesn't change. Certainly you can learn more, you can continue to be a continuous leader, but your IQ is determined by age 15. Your personality, you're either an introvert or an extrovert. You can learn to work with those personality types, but they don't change. Myself, I'm an extrovert. Sometimes it's hard for me to not be an extrovert, and in some instances, I really need to be more introverted, and so I have to work with that. People that are introverts are actually our CEO of our hospital defines himself as an introvert, but he gets up there and he can talk to the hugest audience ever. So you can learn to work with your personality type, but your personality type does not change. The only thing that you can change is your EQ, or your emotional intelligence quotient. And I hope that today you'll learn a little bit about that. And if you're so invested in strengthening your EQ or your emotional intelligence quotient, hopefully I'll give you some tips to do that. So IQ leaves at best 75% of job success unexplained. And to say that differently, only 25% of your job success, based on research, is attributed to your IQ. Your IQ does not determine who will succeed and who will fail. We know that. You can look at people around you and say, wow, that person is so smart, but look at where they are in life. And that person, didn't do very well in school, but they own their own company and are extremely successful. So it's really the balance of both your IQ and your EQ that make you successful. And Albert Einstein has a quote that I think fits well here. And he says, we should take care not to make the intellect our God. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality. It cannot lead, it can only serve. So the next slide obviously is an iceberg, and empowerment through emotional intelligence connects with what you can see with what you cannot see. And obviously the bottom of the iceberg is the biggest piece of the iceberg. You can't see that. But what we don't see are the things that create our behaviors. Our brains are wired to be emotional creatures. Our first response to an event is always going to be an emotional one. There's no control there. You have no control over that. But what you do have control over is the thoughts that follow the emotion, how you react to an emotion as long as you're aware of it. And when I talk in a few minutes about the different domains of emotional intelligence, your self-awareness, to me, is the most important piece to strengthen in emotional intelligence, because you have to be self-aware before you can automatically control how you respond to an event. The next 3 slides are 3 different definitions of emotional intelligence. And I put 3 definitions in here because one might resonate with you more than another does. They all are basically saying the same thing. The first definition is from Dr. Ruvan Baran, and actually I used Dr. Baran's theory when I did my doctoral research on emotional intelligence and his model of emotional social intelligence. He explains and defines emotional intelligence as a set of emotional and social skills that influence the way we perceive and express ourselves, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. Second definition is by Dr. Daniel Goleman, and you may recognize that name. He really streamed emotional intelligence out of purely just the sociology and psychology world in the 1990s with his book Emotional Intelligence, and it really spearheaded it into the mainstream public. And he defines emotional intelligence a little bit simpler. He says it's the ability to control impulses, delay gratification, regulate one's mood, and when faced with frustrating situations, can continue to be motivated and show empathy. So there's empathy again. And the last definition is from Salovey and Mayer. And again, they also wrote a lot on emotional intelligence, these two guys. And they explained and defined it as the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions, to discriminate among them, and use this information to guide one's thinking and actions. So those are three different definitions that you can come back to later and see which one resonates the most. I said this a bit ago, but the concept of emotional intelligence was introduced by Peter Salovey and John Mayer in 1990s, and in 1995 is when Dr. Goleman wrote his book entitled Emotional Intelligence. The next slide is what it is and what it isn't. So emotional intelligence is not about being nice all the time. That's impossible. No one's going to be nice all the time. It's not about being touchy-feely. It's not about being emotional, and it's not about having a high IQ. What it is about is being honest, being aware of your feelings and those of others, being smart with your emotions, and having street smarts. Meaning you need to know what you can say and what you can't say based on the situation that you're in. Certainly, if you're in a board meeting, you're going to express your emotions a bit differently than if you're speaking with friends. So you need to have street smarts when speaking in whatever forum that you're in based on that particular forum. I'd like to usually when I speak about emotional intelligence, right here, use a quote from Maya Angelou, which I'm sure you've heard. And I love this quote, and it resonates with me so much because it's, I think, so absolutely true. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think about that every single time I talk to somebody, especially when I'm in a situation where I am emotional. I think, listen, because once something comes out of your mouth and you've said it, it's done. So we have to think about all the words that come out of our mouth and how they're going to impact someone and how they're going to make them feel. So here are the 4 domains of emotional intelligence. The first domain is self-awareness, which I talked about before, which to me is the most important domain. They're all important, but you're not going to get anywhere if you don't really focus on that self-awareness domain. The next is self-management. The third is empathy or social awareness, and relationship management and interpersonal skills. And on this slide, I have a lot of subcategories. I'm not going to really talk about those subcategories necessarily. If you read more about emotional intelligence, it goes into a very many different subgroups. But the next couple slides, I'm going to explain each of those domains in a little bit more detail. So the first domain of self-awareness is, if you're self-aware, you know yourself as you really are. You don't see yourself through rose-colored glasses. You know your blind spots. You know the triggers that are going to make you go off. You know the people that are going to make you go off. If you're going into a meeting and you know particular people are going to be in that meeting, You have to be mentally prepared for that and think about what you're going to say before you say it. Hardwired emotional reactions to anything come before you've even had a chance to respond. So if you are self-aware, you have emotional responses hardwired already. You know if you're prepared for what you're getting into, and you know yourself, you have your hardwired reactions already to go. Getting in touch with your emotions takes honesty and courage. And at the end of the presentation, I have a short little self-assessment for you to take away with you, which goes through each of the domains, and you can score yourself and you can see, but it takes honesty. And that's what this bullet point means. They're self-assessments. So you have to be honest about them when you fill them out. If you have any attempt, or if you're serious about helping to increase your emotional intelligence. Self-management is the second domain I talked about, and that's your ability to use your awareness of your emotions and actively choose what you say and do. Hardwire those responses like I talked about earlier. If you understand your emotions, you have the power to take control of difficult situations and to react nimbly. Emotional intelligence is about understanding that our behavior is driven by our emotions and our perceptions. That sounds easy, but it's not that easy to really put it into practice. The next domain, the third domain, is social awareness. Social awareness is centered on your ability to recognize and understand the emotions of others. To become more socially aware, you must be able to give others your full attention. And one thing I have to say about that, in the environment that we live in today, that's a difficult one to attain. We have phones. I have a work phone and I have a personal phone. You have a lot of ways that people can get in touch with you. And when I make it a practice really, when somebody comes in to talk to me and I'm meeting with someone, that I give them my full attention. I put my phones away. They're on silence. They're away from me, because nothing is more distracting to somebody that wants your full attention and that you need to give your full attention if you're being distracted. I don't know if you've ever met with somebody that, while you're talking to them, they're checking their phone, or they're looking at their computer and eye contact isn't happening. You're not being socially aware when that happens. You need to look outward. You need to use both your eyes and your senses when you're talking to somebody, because somebody could be talking and they sound okay, but they're talking really fast. They're talking really loud. All of those things should be triggers to you that something might not be right. And then the last domain is relationship management. And working on a relationship takes time, it takes effort, and it takes know-how. And the know-how is the emotional intelligence that we're talking about today. And relationships are an essential and fulfilling part of our life. We need relationships. We can't do anything by ourselves. So just to sum up what I just said about those 4 domains of emotional intelligence, the first 2 are personal competence. They're about you, your self-awareness domain and your self-management domain. The second 2 are social competence. They're about you and others, self-management domain and relationship management domain. So those are the 4 domains of emotional intelligence. I was amazed by this when I did my research, and I speak a lot about emotional intelligence and I read a lot about emotional intelligence, and I was amazed that we have about 400 emotional experiences in a day. And maybe I shouldn't have been surprised about that, but I think that's a lot of emotional experiences to have. And being tuned into them and increasing your emotional intelligence can help you produce the behavior that you want. And that's, again, all wrapped around that self-awareness domain. And emotional intelligence, or EQ, is the foundation of critical skills. If you master your emotions, it flows into everything that you do. Again, I just want to reiterate, what I said a little bit earlier, that our brains are wired to make us emotional creatures. Our first response to an event, think about it. Just think about any event that you have in your life that is impactful, triggers an emotional response. There's no control there. You get emotional. But what you do have control over, and this is something that takes mastery, is the emotional reaction and how you react to it. What comes out of your mouth, how you respond. You have control of how you respond. Bradbury and Greaves are two authors that write a lot about emotional intelligence. And when they did research, they showed that only 36% of people they tested were able to adequately identify their emotions as they happen. So that's pretty amazing. That's not a lot of people. So that whole self-awareness and how you're feeling really takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of energy. So the next slide is just really showing what I talked about before, how emotional intelligence, or EQ, is the foundation for all critical skills that we have, whether they're in our workplace, in our professional life, or in our home environment. And a little effort that we spend on increasing our EQ tends to have wide-ranging impact on your life. Both, again, I think probably even in my personal life was probably more affected by working on my emotional intelligence, because at work, we all tend to be different people than we are at home. You feel a little more comfortable at home. And so some of the things that you say and do can be hurtful to people. And maybe not really following the principles or the domains of emotional intelligence. So focusing on them really helps you in both settings. But this slide just shows, the trunk of the tree being your EQ, and then all the leaves of the tree, all the things that you have to work on and experience every day can really benefit from fine-tuning and increasing your emotional intelligence. So now I'm going to talk about emotional intelligence during a crisis. And of course, one that's very near and dear to us and close to us right now is the coronavirus pandemic. And I really do feel, and all that I've read about recently, is it's proven to really be the greatest test of our emotional intelligence in a generation. And you can see it in action. And the people that are doing a good job and the people that really probably need to have a little more focus. And as your conduit of influence, your emotional intelligence delivers your IQ. You need both, but your EQ delivers your IQ. It is the way you convey your knowledge, skills, and experience to generate performance and results. I'm going to show you about a 4-minute video. And this video is from just a little snippet from a consulting group called 6 Seconds Consulting. And they're talking about anxiety and purpose and how emotional intelligence can help us during these stressful and uncertain times. So I think he said a couple of really important things in that little clip. And I think when we do have a lot of stress that comes upon us, we do want to isolate. We do want to be alone. But we can't solve our problems that way. And maybe that would be our initial response, but we really need to look ahead. We need to look to the future. And in order to do that, we need to tap into our emotions. And so the next couple slides, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to lead with emotional intelligence. And the first one fits very nicely, I think, with the presentation, the little video clip we just saw, is balancing your thinking and feeling brain. Don't allow your emotions to hijack your behavior, and avoid extremes. Certainly, you don't want to be Spock-like and in your demeanor, and people think you don't care. But also, if you're prone to escalating emotions, you really can't help others de-escalate. So you really need to balance that thinking and feeling brain. Your thinking or rational brain represents your conscious thoughts, your ability to make calculations, your ability to reason you need all of those things to express, to get different options, to express ideas. You need that rational brain, but you also need your feeling brain, which is your limbic system. That represents your emotions, your impulses, your intuitions, your instincts. You need both of them together. And the communication between your emotional and your rational brain is the physical source of emotional intelligence. And this is where I want to go back to David Caruso's quote in the beginning, where he said, emotional intelligence is not the opposite of intelligence. It's not the triumph of heart over head. It's an intersection of both. And that is very true. So that's the first tip. The second tip is create psychological safety. When you're in a group and you need to come up with a solution, you don't want groupthink, but you don't want so much conflict that people can't work together. You need to have many ideas in order to come up with a final decision. You need to promote collaboration and teamwork, but people need to feel that they're safe to offer up those ideas, that you're creating psychological safety for them. The third tip is to welcome dissent, and that might sound odd to you, but you want disagreement in a group. You want diversity of thought. You want people not to agree with you. You want constructive dissent to solve problems and find solutions. Again, you have to do this without people feeling threatened. You want disagreement, you want spirited discussion, but you want to do it in a way that people feel comfortable with it. And here's empathy again. Number 4 is to model empathy. Keep in mind that the crisis, whatever it is impacting everyone differently. And remind yourself that you have no idea what other people are going through. Everybody is going through something different, and this should center you and make you more understanding. I think we need a mindset that most people are doing the best they can given the times of uncertainty, and we're all in it together and we can conquer it together. People walk through our lives every single day and we don't know what they're dealing with. During the COVID crisis, in the beginning of COVID, my mom was in the intensive care unit for 11 days. She was pretty sick. She did get out of ICU, thank God she did. My sister then got COVID. My family was, a mess. But I was coming to work every day. No one really knew all the things that were going on the outside of my life here at work. People who had young children were home. All of a sudden now they're having their kids at home, and they're having to be the teachers at home for their kids and come to work. Everybody was dealing with all sorts of different things, and we just need to be empathetic and be understanding. And everybody has to do their job, but everybody responds and reacts in a different way during a crisis. Let your staff or the people that you're talking to know that you're genuinely interested in hearing what they have experienced during the crisis. People need to ventilate, they need to speak, but you can't just give them lip service. You need to actually make them feel that you care. And going back to what I talked about before, give them your full attention. I know in the job that I'm in, that's difficult to do, but I truly make it a practice to do that because it's important. And I think people really do appreciate it. Calm, patient, and attentive behavior is the most important leadership skill that anyone can have. The fifth tip is to invite challenges and be prepared to be wrong. And these are some questions that I put down here that you need to ask yourself. Certainly during this crisis, we made some wrong decisions and we had to correct those decisions. We got guidance in the beginning that changed, and we had to say, listen, the guidance has changed. Now we're going to do this. We have to be willing to be flexible and change when we need to change. And here are some questions that I would challenge you to ask yourself. Do you invite others to challenge the status quo? Are you personally prepared to be wrong based on the mindset you've developed? That's not something that people like very much, is to be wrong. But we have to, as leaders, we have to self-correct when things don't go the way we've thought they should go and we've prepared for them to go. We have to be able to be flexible. And are you receptive to both people and ideas? And do people perceive that openness? You can ask people for their opinions, but if they don't perceive that you're accepting their suggestions, they're going to shut down and they're not going to offer you any more of their feedback, because they're going to say, it doesn't matter what I say. So we have to be receptive to that feedback. So the next couple slides are tips for helping you to increase your emotional intelligence. And this is just skimming the surface. There's a whole lot more information out there that I would welcome you to look into if you're interested. And I have things in my references at the end, different sources for you to reference. So the first tip is get your stress under control. Intermittent stress is good if under control. It entices the brain to produce cells for improved memory. It's good, but severe stress is bad and it leads to loss of control. And I'm sure you can all think of people in your life, both personally and professionally, that are under severe stress and have lost control. And at that point, they're not doing anyone a service, or if it's you're not doing anybody the best service you can until you can get your stress under control. And how do you do that? These are some simple things, but not so easy to do when you lead a busy life. But the first thing I put down here is cultivate an attitude of gratitude. And when I was doing some research, I came upon a study from UC Davis. And they had their participants think of something that they were grateful for, and found that helped to decrease their stress by decreasing their cortisol levels consistently. So think about something that you're grateful for. Cultivate an attitude of gratitude. Take a walk. Read something other than work-related things, or list, COVID-related things or crisis-related things. Read something enjoyable. Exercise and meditate. I make it a practice every day now. I do, and I've been doing it for the last several years, to meditate 10 or 15 minutes before I come to work every day. It doesn't take a long time. My son, who is very much into different holistic therapies, said to me, you have a stressful job, Mom, you need to meditate. And I said to him, well, I don't have time to meditate. And he said, well, that's why you need to meditate. So I made it a practice 2 years ago to do 10 to 15 minutes, most often 10 minutes of meditation every day before I come to work. And that is not an easy thing to do. It's really hard to, get all the thoughts and all the ideas out of your head and everything that you have to do when you go to work out of your head, and just relax and meditate. But it is possible. The second tip is to clean up your sleep hygiene. When you sleep, the neurons remove the toxic proteins from your brain. Lack of sleep leads to toxic protein buildup, and you feel groggy, you have diminished self-control. It's unlikely that people are going to get more sleep, although I did see a clip on the news yesterday and I have to find this study, that was a study done on sleep habits and dementia, and people that had less than 6 hours of sleep a night had more evidence of dementia as they aged. So I guess 6 is the number now, but you know, the normal number that you hear people say is 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. It's hard to get, you know, more sleep than that. So if you can't get more sleep, here's how you can clean up your sleep hygiene a little bit. Got 20 minutes of morning sunlight a day. Your eyes need at least 20 minutes of pre-noon sunlight to reset your inner clock. That's what the research shows. Turn your computer off at least 2 hours before bedtime. I'm not sure if, you know, if that's possible all the time, but the blue light of the computer tricks your brain because it's very similar to sunlight, making it hard to fall asleep at night than when you go to bed right after you turn your computer off. The next thing is use your bed for sleeping only. A lot of times we work in our bed, you know, we have the computer in the bed or watching TV in the bed. Probably not good, conducive to you falling asleep right away. And the next is to avoid sleeping pills and alcohol to get to sleep because they really interrupt and disturb the normal sleep process. So those are a few tips to clean up your sleep hygiene if you can't get more sleep. The next thing is get your caffeine intake under control. And this is, of course, always a difficult one for me, but caffeine has a 6.5-hour half-life. So the recommendation is no caffeine after noon. Some people say that it doesn't matter to them, it doesn't affect them, that they can sleep, they can have a cup of coffee and go to bed and it can still go to sleep. But I think what you need to know is to know how it affects your body and act accordingly. So those are the few things to increase your a little bit to increase your emotional intelligence and decrease your stress level. The next couple slides is that quick emotional intelligence assessment that I had mentioned early on. And it is quick, it was free, it was something I got offline. When I did my research for my doctoral study, I had a much longer, comprehensive, it was a copyrighted assessment. There's many assessments out there. There's also a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and it was Bradbury and Greaves, who I referenced earlier in the presentation. They wrote this book. It's very simple. It's an easy read. It's in the reference list that I have. They also have attached to the back of that book an assessment in the book too for your emotional intelligence. There are several assessments out there, and this assessment here categorizes your is done by the domains. So the first is your emotional awareness. There's phrases, and then you rate yourself based on those phrases. The second one is emotional management, social emotional awareness, and then the last domain is relationship management. And then at the end, as you can see, there's a little score that you get and a little key at the bottom that describes the areas that you should consider strengthening. Some are going to be weaker than others. You know, there's going to be some domains you're very strong in, and there's going to be other domains that you need to strengthen. And so again, as I said earlier, you need to just be honest when you fill them out, because the only person that's seeing them is yourself. So I would welcome you to take a look at that. And then I'm going to pull everything together with another little video, very short, cute little video that kind of pulls everything together, I think, that I just spoke about today. Okay, the next slide are some references that I referenced a little bit earlier. And that's all I had for the presentation today. I'll turn it back over to Melanie for questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Polidanato. This concludes the slide presentation portion of our program. Now we'd like to begin the question and answer period. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. Please click on the three dots, then click Q&A to open the Q&A panel and direct your questions to all panelists as we try to answer as many questions as we can. So there is one question here, and I think this just might be a clarification question from earlier in your presentation. How many sleep hours per night increase dementia?
Oh, what I had said that I heard from this study was anything less than 6 hours of sleep a night
Okay.
increased your prevalence of developing dementia later in life. And I didn't really read the study. I just heard it on the news, but 6 hours is what they mentioned.
Okay. What are a few things you'd recommend to increase your self-awareness?
I think if what I would say is to stop and ask yourself why you do the things you do. I think also something very important that I utilize for increasing my self-awareness is to seek feedback. Ask others for feedback about how you are in meetings. What feedback do you have for me to make me a better person? And know yourself. I guess the next thing would be to know yourself under stress. Assess how your actions will affect others before you take those actions. So everybody does a good job when things are going well. It's when you're under stress that I think you really need to focus on more. So assess yourself once you're in a stressful situation and how did I do in that situation? What could I have done better? Or ask somebody that was there with you, what could I have done better?
Okay, thank you. And we have another question here. How do you recommend handling anxiety when delivering presentations?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there's several things that you can do for that. And a couple of them that I do is breathing. Breathe, take a couple of deep breaths before your presentation. Those things, people tell you that when you're going in, when you're upset and you're nervous to take some deep breaths, but it really does help to increase the oxygen to your brain and make you feel more calm. I think what I would say too, when I do a lot of presentations, and I think just let it go. So practice the presentation maybe the day before, and that's it. Don't keep referencing the presentation and seeing if you forgot something, and making sure that you're doing that last minute look at the presentation. I think that gives you more anxiety. So I think trying to take deep breaths, be as calm as possible before you go in, know your audience, anticipate. I think something important too is to anticipate the potential questions that could be asked and have some answers for those already. I think that's something that people often get nervous about, that they're not going to know the answer to the question that someone's going to ask them. And if you don't know the answer, and that happens to me a lot of times, is you'll say you look it up and you'll get back to them, because you can't know every single answer every single time. So I think, breathe right. Leave the presentation. Don't look at it the day before, because you've probably looked at it several times already. And I find that the times that I'm probably the most anxious about presentations is when I don't feel I know it enough. And so learn it, understand it, anticipate the questions that may be asked, and then let it go. And don't look at it before, the day that you're going to present. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Those are some great tips. We have another question here. What are some tips to best recover from an emotional intelligence flop?
An emotional intelligence block?
Flop, F-L-O-P.
Flop. I'm not sure if I understand if you did something that was, you were, probably what you're saying is, I think the question is if you've done something that you're regretful for and you didn't respond as you would hoped that you would. You know what I think I would do in that particular case? I hope I'm answering the question correctly, is I would just, go to the person and say, listen, I did not handle that situation well. I mean, I think that's self-management then. Somebody gave you feedback and you're acknowledging that you could have handled that situation better. And I think not ignoring it, not just letting it go. What I've done, and believe me, I've been in those situations plenty of times. I take a day usually, and I go back to the person and say, listen, I could have handled that situation better. I apologize. And I'm going to take the feedback that you're going to give me, hopefully, and do a better job the next time. Because as I said earlier, it's a journey. It's truly a journey, and you're not going to be perfect. And every single day, I think I reassess what I've said or did in my day, and could I have done that differently? And many times I can. And I think as long as you learn from that flop, you're a better person and you're more self-aware. And the next time you probably won't do it.
Yeah, I agree. Taking accountability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions on how to get started on improving your emotional intelligence? That's a good place to start.
Honestly, I think what I would do is to complete one of the self-assessments, whether it's the one that I have in this presentation or any others that you find, and determine the areas that you need to focus on. There's a lot of information out there on how you can do a better job in improving one of the domains of emotional intelligence, and then just begin. I think just begin. Do the assessment to see where your focus areas are, because you're going to be strong in some of those domains. So find out the domain that you need to focus the most on and then begin to improve.
Great. Okay, the webinar will be ending soon. We have a few more minutes for a few more questions before we end the program, if anybody has any further questions. Let's see. So some people see acknowledging emotions as the soft side of leadership. How do you address that feeling?
So I think that addressing emotions is an important skill that leaders need to possess. And I don't believe that it is the soft side of leadership. I think some people will say that, but I really think in order to give somebody the correct guidance that they need, you need to recognize both the emotional and the critical thinking processes that are going on to make a grounded decision. So I think you need both. I think if you're going to be a good leader, you really need to access both the emotional and the rational processes, as I talked about earlier. So yes, I don't think that's the case. I think more and more you'll still see that from time to time, but I think more and more what is written in the literature is saying that it's one of the most important pieces of leadership today.
Excellent, thank you. This concludes our webinar.